I was kicked out of my home because I refused to give my scholarship to my sister. A few years later, they came to ask for help. But it all started much earlier, when I was still a child who had learned to keep quiet. Life seemed simple, or at least that's what I told myself. I was the oldest. In our family, that word didn't refer to age, but to function, alarm clocks, shopping lists, emergency plans. Lena had the status of our star. I had the status of you're more responsible. My childhood smelled of laundry detergent and hot milk, which I warmed up for Lena before rehearsals. She's a sensitive soul, you understand, my mother would say. Everyone has their role. Yours is to keep everything together, my father would add. And I did. I tied knots in my own dreams so that no one would see them. It was easier for me to keep quiet, less friction, less conflict. I learned to be the air in the room, invisible until I disappeared. My first victory came in the form of a letter. A weekend scholarship, a trifle on paper, but for me, a whole continent of opportunities. I brought it home and put it on the kitchen table. My mother smiled surprisingly warmly, and immediately covered the letter with a printout of Lena's competition. Will you move it? This is her chance. The word chance in our family had only one address, it's Lena. My chance was always put off until later. I didn't count the little things, the hours she spent training, the money from the coffee shop that went toward her costumes, my essays that turned into her applications. Every time, I was asked. You don't mind, do you? As if my consent had been written into my birth certificate. But at night, when the apartment fell silent, I caught myself feeling that someone else was breathing inside. Calm, confident, not afraid to say mine. I listened to him and extinguished him like a match with 2 fingers. Because the morning demanded obedience. Injustice lived with us quietly, like a creaking staircase. Everyone hears it, but no one repairs it. When Lena broke mine, it was an accident. When I asked for space, you're dramatizing. I was raised to be a witness, not a heroine. I lit up someone else's stage so that everything in the frame would be beautiful. But sometimes the scenery broke. Once, when my teacher signed me up for an academic competition, my mother answered for me. We'll think about it, we have conflicting dates. The second time was when my father said, pride is good, but the family needs peace. As if my desires were a war. The third time was when I first heard affirm I'm not the background inside me. At the school concert, my mother loudly praised Lena, she's our star. And when the teacher asked, and how is your second daughter? My mother hesitated awkwardly, well, she helps. She never mentioned my name. I stood nearby and felt like a shadow in my own family. That same semester, there was a parent-teacher conference at school. The homeroom teacher praised me for my project, but my mother, without listening, interrupted. We're more worried about Lena, she's in the finals of the competition. When the teacher later asked me quietly in the hallway, what do you want, I was afraid of my own answer. Because for the first time I thought, don't be the background. And it sounded so loud that I felt ashamed. For a long time, I thought that strength was a cry. Now I know, strength is silence that cannot be broken. It grows when you are not thanked, when you push your plate away after dinner and no one notices. A stone crystallized inside me, small but heavy. I clenched it every time another chance passed me by. And I thought, someday this stone will become a foundation. Sometimes I rehearsed other dialogues. I walk into the kitchen and say, enough. Mom doesn't look away. Dad asks, what do you want? In these fantasies, my back straightened, my voice didn't tremble. But I turned off the water, wiped the table, and went to bed. And in the morning, everything would return to normal. Until the time when someday knocked on the door, not as a promise, but as a demand. I didn't know then that a real opportunity was already on its way, in someone else's letter, someone else's signature, someone else's it's fair. And that my silent be useful would soon be shattered by their, it has to be this way. I didn't know yet that my chance was already in someone else's hands. I started working in high school. After class, I would run to the coffee shop, where my hands smelled of coffee grounds and my fingers were sticky from syrups and plastic lids. My classmates wrote essays about their dreams, while I learned how to make cappuccino. I didn't save my salary for myself, but for Lena, for costumes, trips, tutors. She has talent. You can see that, my mother would say when I gave her an envelope with money. I saw it. But at the same time, I put my own desires in that invisible drawer that no one ever opened. One summer, I was offered an internship at a prestigious school. The scholarship covered most of the expenses. I only had to find money for travel and food. I brought the letter home with shining eyes. My mother shrugged. Lena has a training camp before the championship. Someone has to go with her. Someone always meant me. I silently put my letter under a pile of bills. That evening, for the first time, I felt my dream suffocating inside me. When it was time to apply to university, I received a recommendation for the program I had been dreaming of for years. My heart was pounding, this could be my start. But again, later. The whole family rallied around Lena, her exams, her schedule, her nerves. They decided yes for me. I stayed home for another year to play it safe. I worked 2 jobs. During the day, I had an office job, endless spreadsheets that blinded my eyes. In the evening, I tutored, because I was good at explaining the material. Money flowed into Lena's pockets again, books, courses, competitions. It's mutual help, my parents explained. But I was always the one helping. Sometimes I felt like a shadow. Lena shone on stage, received awards, and was talked about at family gatherings. I sat on the sidelines and applauded. And every time I wanted to shout, "Have you ever looked at me?" The worst thing was not the sacrifices. The worst thing was that they were taken for granted. No one thanked me. No one noticed. My role was like the rails on which someone else's train rushed by. Rails don't get applause, they are simply used. I remember one evening. I came home after my shift, exhausted, in jeans that smelled of coffee. Lena was sitting on the sofa crying because her costume hadn't been sewn in time. My mother was stroking her back, my father was already looking for the tailor's number, ready to pay any price. I stood by the door with my hands red from washing up and waited for someone to look at me. No one looked. I went to the kitchen and started washing the dishes. The water splashed louder than our words. A week later, I went to my literature teacher to hand in my essay. She took my text, read the first page carefully, and said, "There is a voice here. It is mature and honest. Don't lose it." "We have other priorities right now," I replied in a voice that wasn't my own. "Priorities are always someone else's will." "The voice is yours," she said and put a list of city scholarships on my desk. I put the sheet of paper in the same invisible chest. Over time, I learned to hide my desires even deeper. It was as if there was a chest inside me. I put letters about scholarships, club posters, sketches, and notes in it. I closed the lid and said to myself, "Someday." But every time I hid another dream there, the glass inside cracked, a small scratch that would eventually spread. Sometimes I didn't recognize myself in the mirror. It was as if someone had erased my contours and left only a shell that served others. And inside me, conflicting feelings tore me apart, anger and shame. Because when I allowed myself to get angry, my mother's voice echoed in my head, "Don't be selfish. This is family." I swallowed my anger like hot coffee that burns your throat, but you drink it anyway because there is no other choice. Somewhere deep down, I knew that the price I was paying was too high. And if this continued, only an empty shell would remain of me. But then I didn't know that the real betrayal, the one that would finally break me, was already approaching. And that my silent yes would one day turn into a loud no. A great opportunity came into my life quietly, in an ordinary envelope in my mailbox. It was a scholarship for a program abroad, my long-held dream. I had been working toward this for years, part-time jobs, nights spent with books, essays I wrote while others slept. When I opened the envelope, my hands trembled so much that the letters blurred. For the first time in a long time, I felt that this was for me. I put the letter on the table in the living room. My mother glanced at it and nodded as if it were an advertisement from a newspaper. It's interesting, of course. But Lena has a business project. She's trying hard. And you're always persistent, you'll apply again. My mother's words sounded like a compliment, but they cut like a sentence. I now had to give way to her now again. A few days later, I overheard a conversation in the kitchen. My mother was talking to my father. My aunt is willing to help, but let the money go to Lena. She's just starting out, she needs more. What about her? My father asked quietly. She's strong, she'll find another opportunity, my mother replied. Later, I found out that my mother herself had asked my aunt to transfer the money to her card, explaining that it was more convenient. My aunt believed her and said that it was indeed faster. And that's what gave the family the opportunity to completely control my support before I had a chance to decide anything. At that moment, I realized that the decision had already been made. My money, my support from my aunt, my plans, everything had been transferred to Lena. I tried to fight back. I pulled the letters from my aunt out of the drawer, where it was written in black and white, "This is for you, baby. I believe in your start." I spread them out on the table. Look. She wrote them for me, not for Lena. Mom looked past me. Dad stared at his phone. Lena sat in her chair and said nothing, with the same smile that appeared when she knew she had one. "You're jealous," Mom said quietly. "And that's not nice. We're a family. One person's success is everyone's success. What about my years? My nights? My money? Isn't that success?" I blurted out. My father shook his head. "Don't make a scene. It's for the good of the family." I stood in the middle of the living room with the letter in my hands and felt the ground slipping away from under my feet. I had a dream I had suffered for, nurtured, and proven. And now it had been crossed out with one word, fair. In the evening, I heard Lena laughing with someone on the phone through the wall. Her voice sounded like triumph. And my heart was beating so loudly that I could barely breathe. In the darkness, I was overcome with real anger for the first time. Not quiet, stifled by shame. But anger that straightened my back and whispered, "Enough." And I suddenly thought, I had been silent for too long. And, apparently, to them it looked like consent. I felt bitter. They had learned to use my silence as a pass to any injustice. I came to my father with evidence. Letters from my aunt, her clear words, "This is for you, child. For your start." I laid them out on the kitchen table, which remembered our dinners and laughter. I wanted to believe that if he saw it in black and white, he would stop this madness. The envelope bore the stamp, award letter #S3417, Global Fellows Program. The letter itself said in black and white, "The grant amount is $2,500 for the first semester plus $700 for relocation." And on my phone, a message from my aunt was still flashing, "Internal transfer memo, transfer for you. Use it wisely." The terms of the grant were clear, only I could receive the funds, after confirmation of my enrollment in the program. The payment was made to the student's personal account, and no redirections to other cards or accounts were allowed. It was an individual contract. My name was clearly stated as the sole recipient. My aunt's letter included the date and a note, transfer of $2,500 for the first semester plus $700 for relocation. Recipient, you. My mother said. "We've already discussed this. It would be more convenient if the money went toward launching Lena's project. It's a family business, after all." "And where does that leave me?" I asked. "You're persistent, you'll apply for another program," she snapped, as if dreams were donuts to go with your morning coffee. But he didn't even pick up the letter. You're getting yourself worked up, he said coldly. You always make a mountain out of a molehill. Mom stood nearby with her arms crossed. Her face was stony. In the living room, Lena cried loudly on purpose so that we could all hear her. She knew that tears were the strongest currency in our family. I dared to try again. It's my right. I've earned this opportunity. You can't just take it away from me. There was silence. I waited for at least a glance, some kind of reaction. Finally, my mother spoke. Either you accept this, or you leave. Leave. 2 words that fell to the floor like stones. My breath caught in my throat. Were they really ready to kick me out? For saying no for the first time? My father sighed. No ultimatums. We are a family. And that's when I realized, for them, family meant one thing: I had to silently accept any injustice. As soon as I protested, I became the enemy. Pack your things, my mother said flatly, without emotion. That was the worst part, not the shouting, not the tears, but the cold decision. I climbed the stairs to my room. Each step echoed in my chest. The house where I grew up suddenly became foreign. The walls that had once been a refuge now felt oppressive. I packed 2 bags, a few things, a few books, a framed photo. My whole life in 2 bags. When I came downstairs, my mother was already waiting at the door. She held out her hand. The keys. I placed the cold metal in her palm. At that moment, I felt as if I had been erased from my own life. As if I were a tenant who had fallen behind on her rent. On my way out, I looked back at the landing. On the floor was a box with my academic achievement certificates. They didn't fit in my bags. Next to it was a badge from my first part-time job, bent like a tin can. I took only my grandmother's photo. I left the rest. The house knew how to erase everything that was not about Lena in seconds. I turned around one last time. My father turned away. My mother was looking at her phone. Lena sat with a blanket over her shoulders and pretended to be cold. Not a word. Not a hint of doubt in their eyes. I went out into the dark yard. The air smelled of wet asphalt. I stood there with my bags and realized I no longer had a home. Not just a physical place, they had taken away the very idea of home. That night, I felt true emptiness for the first time. Betrayal that cuts deeper than any words. They didn't just support Lena. They kicked me out for daring to be myself. I walked down the street and every step echoed in my head, "You're alone. You're alone. You're alone." And at the same time, something new was being born inside me, small and fragile, like a spark in the ashes. A spark that whispered, "It hurts, but you're free." The first weeks after my expulsion were like a long night without dawn. I slept on my friend's sofa. It smelled of dust and old newspapers. In the morning, I went to work part-time in a store, standing on my feet for 10 hours, answering customers. "Is this in stock?" I smiled, even though my feet were burning with fatigue. Each receipt was a small victory. Each paid bill was a knot in the rope that kept me from falling into the abyss. I counted every penny, every hour, every day, when I would be able to save at least a few dollars. Shame ate away at me from the inside. Shame that the family I had clung to for years had kicked me out. Shame that my plans and letters had turned into useless pieces of paper. But alongside the shame lived anger, cold, clear anger. It woke me up at 5 in the morning and wouldn't let me stop. I learned little tricks, buying the cheapest travel pass, looking for free courses, finding odd jobs for a few hours. I reread my old essays, as if checking whether that girl was still alive in me. And somewhere in the midst of everyday life, a plan was born. I enrolled in evening classes at a local college. I found an internship that didn't require a rich resume, just hands that could work in a head that wasn't afraid to learn. That's how I ended up at a small startup. It was no accident. During my evening management classes, I volunteered to sort through the pile of applications in the student office. The teacher noticed how I brought order to the chaos of folders and letters in an hour. He smiled and said, "A founder I know has the same mess in his projects. You should go to him." That's how I got the chance to intern as a coordinator, someone who organizes processes and keeps the team on track. There weren't enough people, there was a lot of work, and everyone was pulling their weight. The interview lasted 7 minutes. "What can you do?" asked the manager. "Organize chaos." "Other people's and my own," I said, surprised at my own honesty. He smiled. "We have a shortage of people who aren't afraid of fire." On my first day, I sorted through hundreds of emails, put stickers on the board, and wrote instructions that, for some reason, no one had written before me. "Can you handle this project?" my boss asked, throwing me a stack of tasks. "Yes," I replied, without even knowing where to start. I worked day and night. My back hurt so much that sometimes I couldn't stand up straight, but my brain was on fire. And when a colleague said for the first time, "You really saved this case," my heart leapt. It wasn't "you have to," or "you're the senior one." It was recognition. Mine. My friends became what my family wasn't. They shared dinner with me, laughed at my jokes, carried my bags when I didn't have the strength. In a small dorm room that smelled of coffee and cheap noodles, we sat at the table, and for the first time I could say out loud, "I'm scared." And instead of condemnation, I heard, "We're here for you." It was a new kind of love, simple, everyday love. On Friday, Anya, Nikita, and I counted our change for pizza. "Get the double cheese." "Today's your lucky day," Anya winked timidly. I laughed and suddenly, for the first time in a long time, I felt that I was being seen here. Fragments of messages popped up on my phone. Unknown, call back. It's important. Mom, are you leaving us? Dad, missed call. Lena, can we talk? Message deleted unread. Over time, I rented a small room with a window facing the courtyard. Now it was my territory. I put a shelf with books, a photo of my grandmother, and a pot with a plant that was learning to survive just like me. The past did not disappear. The pain remained as scars. But they no longer controlled me. I learned to say no without guilt. I set boundaries where I had previously remained silent. Now I understood, you can help, but when it turns into coercion, it is no longer love, but exploitation. In a few years, I finished my studies, got my degree, and assembled a team that became my second family. Sometimes I caught myself feeling proud, not because of money or titles, but because of my inner freedom. Now I could live without permission. And yet, one wound remained. It was like an empty room in my soul. I couldn't go in there, but the smell of the past never went away. At night, I thought, what if they knock on my door? Now I knew the answer. I was no longer that girl with 2 bags. And I would never be her again. The phone rang on a normal workday. On the screen was a number I hadn't seen in years, but knew by heart. I froze. My finger hovered over the reject button. But something inside me whispered, answer it. Hello? My mother's voice was different. It wasn't cold and commanding, like when she kicked me out. It was quiet and broken, like the rustling of dry leaves. She called my name as if it were the last thing she could cling to. I was silent. The silence between us stretched out. She couldn't take it anymore. We made a mistake. We lost everything. Lena's business burned down, we ran out of money, we can't pay for the house anymore. You have to come. She took a breath and added, Lena's partner ran off with the advance payment, leaving us with debts. We were sued for rental penalties. The landlord charged a $1,200 penalty for early termination of the contract, and customers began demanding refunds for canceled orders. All the bills were piling up, and instead of the expected profit, the business turned into a bottomless pit. All that remained of our former ambitions were debts and nervous breakdowns. We lost everything. Daughter, help us now, at least. I sat in my new studio with high ceilings, which my team called our fortress. My projects lay on the table, computers hummed around me, and the evening city spread out in the window. And I listened to that voice from the past. Mom spoke quickly, her words jumbled. She said that Dad had fallen into despair, that Lena was bedridden with nerves, that they all needed me. Her voice broke. Your family. You're our child. The irony hit me like ice water. When I fought for my chance, they called me selfish. When I asked for support, they called me negative. When I said no, they kicked me out. And now I was a child again because it suited them. I imagined their house. The same one where my room was turned into a storage room for Lena's victories. Now there are probably empty closets and the smell of dampness. Lena, who was used to shining, now stands amid the ruins of her own plans. My father, always confident, now sits with his shoulders slumped. And my mother, who once said, "Go away," now begs, "Come back." I was torn between two forces. One was my long-standing habit of saving people. It was in my blood to be a support. The other was a new, hard-won firmness. It reminded me, they cut me off themselves. They closed the door themselves. And now they only come because they have no one else. Blood is more important than anything else, my mother repeated. I barely smiled. Blood only mattered to them when it was convenient. When they used my money, my room, my life. But when I needed even a word of support, blood turned out to be an empty sound. I listened until the end. She asked. Are you still there? Yes. I'm listening. And it was true. I listened to her every word, and it laid the foundation that I had built without them. Those who called me weak now became beggars themselves. They came empty-handed, hoping that I would once again become their infrastructure. An hour after my mother called, Ms. Olga, my childhood neighbor, called. They asked to talk. They say they've come to their senses. I'm not justifying them. It's just, if you want, I can mediate. No pressure. Thank you, Ms. Olga. I'll think about it, I said. And suddenly I felt respect. For the first time, someone wasn't teaching me to forgive, but asking me what I needed. But I was no longer that girl with 2 bags in a dark courtyard. Now I was myself. Strong. Independent. And ready to draw the line. I agreed to meet them in a small cafe near my office. I chose this place specifically, neutral territory where their power no longer applied. When I walked in, they were already sitting by the window. My mother had wrinkles I didn't remember. My father was gray-haired, with a vacant stare. Lena had no makeup on, her hands were shaking. They looked as if life had run them over with a steamroller. Mom spoke first. We were wrong. We're sorry. We're so ashamed. She reached across the table, but I didn't take her hand. I had been waiting for this moment for years. And now it was my turn to speak. Do you remember that night? I asked. They were silent. The night you told me to go away. I was standing there with 2 bags, thinking I no longer had a home. You didn't just kick me out. You destroyed my right to a future. My father opened his mouth, but I raised my hand. No. Now you listen. I spoke calmly, without shouting, but each word hit harder than a scream. You called me selfish when I tried to protect what was mine. You said I was negative when I refused to give up my dream. You built Lena's life on my sacrifices. And when I said no for the first time, you decided to cut me out of the family. Lena's chin trembled. She whispered. I didn't want it to happen. I looked at her and felt a strange sense of relief. I was no longer angry. Inside, there was only clarity. Maybe you didn't want it to happen. But you allowed it to happen. You took everything, knowing it was mine. And then I lost more than just an opportunity. I lost you. Mom cried. Dad clenched his teeth, but his hands trembled slightly. They begged. We've changed. We need you. You're our daughter. I took a breath and said what I had been carrying inside me for years. I am not your support. I am not your infrastructure. I am not a bank or a shadow. I am no longer a victim. And I will not return to that role. I will not return. But so that you don't go hungry, I can pay your utilities for this month. Separately, for Lena, a psychologist's contact information and a list of free retraining programs. All without meetings and without the debt of you now owe us. Mom nodded through her tears. For the first time, I saw how the word boundaries became a reality rather than a threat. Silence fell. For the first time in a long time, my voice filled the space, and no one could drown it out. I stood up. They started to say something, but I wasn't listening anymore. I took my bag from the chair, straightened my shoulders, and felt something new and solid, like steel, take hold inside me. On my way out, I paused for a moment and looked back. They sat there, small and confused, like people who were alone with their mistakes for the first time. And I realized that their despair no longer bound me. I stepped outside. The autumn air was cold but clear. I took a deep breath and felt light. Finally, I was free. Without guilt. Without burden. Without the role that had been imposed on me. I walked forward, and for the first time in my life, I knew that this path belonged only to me.